My name is Blair. I'm 34 years old. And I never imagined that the last time I'd see my father alive in memory, it would also be the moment my husband decided to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. His name is Eric, and we've been married for 10 years. Our relationship had its ups and downs, like most, but I never thought he could stoop so low. And yet, as I sat beside my father's casket, fresh grief pressing down on my chest, he handed me divorce papers. Right there, in the middle of my father's funeral. Before I go further into what happened next, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want more real-life stories about family drama, emotional courage, and moments that change lives, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. You won't want to miss what happens next. I still remember the moment with perfect clarity. The white envelope, thick and official, sliding across the polished wooden pew between us. The undertaker's quiet shuffle behind us, the soft echo of the organ playing a hymn, and my father's favorite rose-colored lilies scattered across the casket. Everything seemed suspended in time. People around us were whispering, some discreetly pointing, while others froze mid-step, unsure if they should intervene. The entire chapel felt like it had narrowed into a single, suffocating tunnel, and all I could see was Eric's smirk, expecting the reaction he wanted. I didn't respond immediately. Shock froze me. My fingers brushed the envelope, feeling the weight of every word inside before I even opened it. It felt like he had chosen the worst possible moment, and yet the audacity of it somehow made the air crackle with tension. My mother's hand was gripping mine, so tightly I thought her fingers might leave bruises. I could hear my little brother shifting uneasily beside me, probably trying to act calm, trying to hold it together. The funeral had been tense enough already. Dad had passed unexpectedly, and emotions were raw. But this was different. This wasn't grief. This was betrayal, public and deliberate. As I looked up at Eric, I wanted to scream, not just at him, but at the universe. Why now? Why here? And yet I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught somewhere between rage, grief, and disbelief. The chapel's stained glass windows caught the sunlight in jagged, colorful patterns across the floor, and for a moment, I felt like I was trapped inside one of those fractured reflections. Everything distorted, nothing whole. People's eyes flickered toward us again. Some were polite, some curious, and I swear, a few were judging. I could feel their silent questions. Is this happening? Did she know? How could he? My mind raced back to the years leading up to this moment. 10 years of marriage, of building a life together. And yet the small cracks had always been there. Late-night arguments about money. Silent mornings where Eric would leave for work without a word, leaving me to handle everything at home. The subtle way he dismissed my opinions in front of friends, never outright mean, but always condescending. At first, I had forgiven him, or convinced myself it was nothing. But grief stripped all pretense away. And now, this envelope, thick with legal authority, was like a knife through the center of everything I thought I knew about our life together. I could feel my father's absence pressing down on me. He had always been the one I leaned on when life felt unfair. I remembered him sitting at the kitchen table years ago, looking over his glasses at me as I complained about Eric's behavior. "Blair," he had said gently, "sometimes people show who they really are when it matters most. Don't forget that." I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking he was being dramatic, but now, with grief twisting my chest into knots, I realized he had been right. Eric's timing wasn't just cruel, it revealed exactly who he was. The envelope felt heavier in my hand. I glanced around the chapel, taking in familiar faces blurred by tears and shock. Aunt Linda had her hand over her mouth, muttering something to Dad's best friend. My younger cousin, barely old enough to understand funerals, kept peeking up at me with wide eyes, sensing the tension without knowing why. Even the funeral director, who had been efficiently arranging flowers moments before, paused mid-step, looking like he had stumbled into a scene he hadn't signed up for. Eric leaned closer, just enough so that only I could hear, and whispered with a smug, controlled tone, "You know, Blair, maybe it's time you faced reality. Sign these, and we both get closure." Closure, as if grief and betrayal could be measured neatly on a legal form. His eyes held a strange mix of confidence and calculation, the kind I had seen many times before, but never so intentionally cruel. My first instinct was to throw the papers back at him, to yell, to shatter the quiet, respectful atmosphere. But something inside me paused. Something quiet, something that had been building over years of small indignities. I remember sitting there, breathing shallowly, my mind racing faster than my heart could keep up. I felt the weight of every step that had led to this moment. The nights I cried silently in our bedroom, the afternoons I swallowed my words when I should have spoken up, the countless tiny humiliations that had piled up over a decade. And then, unexpectedly, clarity arrived. In that charged, devastating moment, I realized that I was stronger than I thought. Not because of what I would do next, but because I could recognize what he had done and survive it. I could hear my father's voice in my head again, steady and calm. "Don't let anyone take away your dignity, Blair. Even in the worst moment, you have a choice." That voice felt like a lifeline. And as I looked back at Eric, I realized that the power wasn't entirely his. Not anymore. Even here, in this chapel, amid mourning, I had a choice. Meanwhile, subtle murmurs spread through the chapel like ripples across a pond. Some guests were whispering, trying to decide if they should intervene. I caught snippets. Did he really just... And is she going to... Each fragment of conversation felt like a reminder that this moment wasn't just private. It was witnessed, observed, and silently judged. The awareness of everyone around me heightened every heartbeat, every breath, every pulse of tension. I felt my mother's grip tighten on my hand, her concern unspoken but overwhelming. She had always been protective, but grief had made her fragile, and I didn't want to add to her burden. My little brother shifted closer to me, trying to offer support without words, and for the first time that day, I noticed the small acts of love and solidarity around me. These subtle, human moments grounded me, reminding me that even in the middle of betrayal, I wasn't entirely alone. As I considered my next move, a strange calm began to settle over me, like the eye of a storm. The envelope sat in my lap, the papers inside heavy with consequence, but my mind had begun to organize itself. I realized that I didn't need to react in anger. I didn't need to scream or make a scene. Every reaction I made could be deliberate, strategic, and measured. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. This wasn't just about him humiliating me. It was about him underestimating me. Even in the silence of the chapel, the world seemed to slow down. The soft echo of the organ, the distant sobs, the whispered condolences, all of it faded into the background as I focused inward. I replayed every argument, every silent insult, every slight of disregard, and I saw a pattern emerge. It wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't just bad timing. It was a belief that I would always react predictably, that I would crumble under pressure. And now, for the first time, I realized he was wrong. I also noticed small, subtle details that made the betrayal even more tangible. The flowers my father loved, the photos of him smiling at family gatherings, the scent of his cologne faintly lingering on the casket, these things reminded me of everything worth fighting for. Grief and anger intertwined, creating a strange clarity. The funeral had become not just a place of mourning, but a stage where true character was revealed. Eric's smirk faltered slightly when he noticed my composure. That tiny, almost imperceptible crack in his confidence fueled me in ways I hadn't expected. Every muscle in my body felt alert, aware, ready to act. I realized that I wasn't powerless, not here, not now. My father's absence didn't make me weak. It made me sharper, more aware of the life I wanted to reclaim. And in the background, the world continued. People whispered, chairs scraped, a child shifted uncomfortably, someone's phone quietly buzzed in a pocket. Life continued, even in this moment of personal catastrophe. And I understood that this was exactly the point. Life doesn't wait for anyone's timing, grief doesn't pause for anyone's plans, and betrayal doesn't respect sacred moments. Finally, as the organ swelled to a gentle crescendo, I realized something pivotal. The envelope was no longer just a tool of humiliation. It was a symbol. It represented all the times I had felt powerless, all the moments I had swallowed my pride, all the years I had given too much and received too little in return. And in that realization, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't defeated. I wasn't broken. I was awake, aware, and ready for what came next. I turned slightly, allowing Eric to see my eyes meet his, steady and unwavering. I didn't speak. I didn't react immediately, but I didn't need to. The silence said everything. The entire chapel seemed to hold its breath with me. The choice, though not yet verbalized, was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet thrill of control. Even now, I can feel the weight of that moment. The mixture of grief, anger, and unexpected empowerment is something I will never forget. It was the moment that redefined everything, my marriage, my sense of self, and my understanding of what strength really meant. And as the funeral continued around us, I knew that my next steps, deliberate and measured, would change the course of our lives in ways Eric had never anticipated. The quiet after the funeral felt almost unnatural. People were filing out of the chapel, murmuring condolences, exchanging gentle embraces. But inside me, the storm Eric had unleashed still raged. I gripped the envelope in my hand, the divorce papers pressed against my palm, and I realized I was still sitting on that same pew, refusing to move. Something about the weight of grief had mixed with the weight of betrayal in a way that left me numb and hyper-aware all at once. As the last few mourners shuffled past, I felt the familiar pang of resentment creep in, not the sharp, fleeting anger of a single insult, but the slow, insidious kind that had been quietly threading through our marriage for years. I remembered the early days when I had married Eric in what I thought was love. He had been charming, attentive, even patient in a way that felt like devotion. But over time, the small cracks began to form. Late-night dinners alone while he stayed in his office. Snide remarks masked as jokes, dismissed immediately if I showed discomfort. The subtle way he would erase my contributions, whether at family gatherings or within our shared home, leaving me feeling like an invisible partner. I shifted my weight and looked around, noticing my brother whispering something to my mother. They hadn't seen the papers yet, or if they had, they hadn't reacted. That gave me a moment to breathe, to let my mind wander back over years of minor betrayals that, in hindsight, were never minor at all. I thought about the nights I had cried silently in the bathroom after he had walked away from arguments, refusing to engage, leaving me to wrestle with the frustration and humiliation alone. I thought about my career, my ambitions, the dreams I had quietly shelved so I could accommodate his needs, his schedule, his ego. The funeral director quietly cleared the aisle, adjusting the chairs and polishing the wooden pews. It was a mundane, almost antiseptic act, but in that ordinary motion, I found a strange kind of grounding. Life went on around us, indifferent to grief, betrayal, or heartbreak. And yet my marriage had always felt like that too, routine, polite on the surface, but filled with little abrasions that never healed. I remembered one evening, Years ago, when I had been planning a small birthday dinner for my father, I wanted Eric to participate, to show some care, but he had brushed it off. "Can't we do it next week?" "I've got too much to do," he had said, tossing the words casually, as if my father's celebration was insignificant. I had forced a smile, masking my hurt, swallowing my disappointment. That moment had seemed trivial then, but now it felt emblematic of a pattern I could no longer ignore. Every small disregard, every invisible slight, had added up, creating an undercurrent of isolation I had grown accustomed to but never accepted as normal. I glanced at Eric sitting a few rows ahead, talking softly to someone in a low voice. His demeanor was calm, but I could sense a tension under the surface. A subtle shift I had learned to notice after years of observing his mannerisms. The slight furrow of his brow, when no one else was looking, the way his jaw tightened when he realized he wasn't getting the reaction he expected. I realized that this moment, the funeral and the papers, had revealed something deeper about him. His arrogance. He assumed that I would crumble under pressure. That grief would make me pliable. He underestimated the quiet strength I had cultivated over years of enduring his neglect. I thought about the nights we had shared as a couple, sitting in silence while the TV droned on, our conversations reduced to functional exchanges. "Did you pay the bills?" "I picked up the groceries." I had tried, at first, to inject warmth, humor, curiosity, but each attempt had been met with mild indifference, the subtle signals of a man whose attention was elsewhere. Those nights now felt like training grounds, preparing me, without my awareness, to handle moments like this, when courage and clarity were more important than sentiment. The divorce papers on my lap seemed to glow with a strange significance. They weren't just documents. They were a mirror reflecting the true state of my marriage. For years, I had tried to reconcile hope with reality, convincing myself that Eric would change, that we could be partners in the way I had always imagined. But the paper in my hand, crisp and official, symbolized the truth I had been avoiding, that hope was no longer enough, that change was never coming, and that my quiet endurance had only allowed him to believe he had control. I remembered another incident from just a year ago when we had hosted my father's retirement party. Eric had been distant, dismissive of the conversations, checking his phone constantly. When my father mentioned the long hours I had spent organizing the event, Eric had nodded politely but quickly diverted the attention elsewhere. I had felt small, unappreciated, but I had smiled anyway, masking my frustration with humor. The memory brought a familiar mix of anger and sorrow. I realized now that every ignored effort, every erased contribution had been a shadow over our marriage, a shadow that Eric never even acknowledged, assuming I would always step aside. I shifted slightly, noticing how the light from the stained glass played across the chapel floor, creating intricate patterns that reminded me of the fractured pieces of my life. Each colored shard felt symbolic, representing moments of disappointment, neglect, and invisible struggle. And yet, in that same pattern, I saw faint streaks of light, the moments where I had persevered, where I had advocated for myself quietly, where I had stood firm without fanfare. Those faint streaks gave me a strange sense of empowerment. They reminded me that even in shadows, there was light. Even in betrayal, there was clarity. The whispers of the remaining funeral attendees floated around me, blending with the soft hum of the organ. I could feel my own pulse in my ears, rapid and insistent, a reminder that my body was alive with tension and awareness. Eric leaned slightly forward, speaking to someone just out of my line of sight. I imagined him crafting some narrative in his mind, how I might react, how others might perceive us, how he could manipulate the scene even in my father's absence. But I had moved beyond surprise. I had passed that threshold where shock becomes an instrument. Now, every glance he made, Every word he spoke was an opportunity for me to observe, to calculate, to understand the real man behind the polished facade. The shadows of our marriage were not just in big moments. They were in the mundane, the routine, the small corners of life where neglect quietly grows. I thought about grocery store trips where I carried the weight of both our expectations, about mornings where I woke alone despite promises of companionship, about dinners where I pretended everything was fine while inside I simmered with quiet resentment. Each shadow had contributed to the woman sitting here now, steady-handed, clear-eyed, and ready to face a man who had miscalculated entirely. And yet, beneath all the anger, there was grief, not just for my father, but for the version of my life I had hoped for with Eric. I mourned the warmth that had never arrived, the partnership that had always been one-sided, the dreams I had carefully shelved to maintain the illusion of harmony. Grief and anger intertwined, creating a complex, almost unbearable weight on my chest. But within that weight, I felt a strange clarity. I could honor my father's memory, acknowledge my sorrow, and simultaneously recognize the truth about my marriage. I thought back to our wedding day, the sun bright and warm, our vows exchanged in front of friends and family. The words had felt meaningful then, filled with promise, but the reality had been different. The promises were hollow, carried only in ceremonies and never in action. I had clung to hope because hope had been safer than confrontation. And now, as the chapel emptied and the murmurs faded, I realized that hope had finally run its course. The shadows were no longer just a backdrop. They were a map of everything I needed to confront, understand, and ultimately leave behind. I looked down at Eric again, watching him carefully. I noticed the small gestures that had always irritated me, but now felt almost amusing in their predictability, the way he adjusted his cuff, the brief glance around the room as if measuring the reactions, the tight line of his mouth when he realized I wasn't visibly shaken. These details were shadows of the man he had always been: self-assured, calculating, unaware that his control was an illusion. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was seeing him clearly, not through anger, not through disappointment, but through the lens of truth. The chapel felt quiet now, the air heavy with lingering grief and unspoken tension. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of life continuing despite the rupture of my personal world. And I understood something profound. Marriages don't just fracture in big, dramatic moments. They fracture in small, cumulative ways, through neglect, through unspoken resentments, through quiet disregard. Those fractures had been hidden beneath the surface, invisible to everyone but me, until now. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and let my gaze drift over the room one last time. Every object, the wooden pews, the polished floor, the floral arrangements, felt like a witness to a life that had been half-lived, half-hidden, half-betrayed. And within that space, I found a strange, unexpected clarity. The shadows of my marriage were not just a source of pain. They were a roadmap showing me exactly where I had endured too much and where I had the strength to stand firm. I looked down at the envelope again, sitting on my lap like it had been waiting for me all along. The organ's soft melody had faded into a background hum, replaced by the faint shuffle of shoes and the occasional whispered conversation. Eric was still ahead, his posture rigid, his hands resting lightly on the pew in front of him. I could see the subtle flicker of anticipation in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension that betrayed his confidence. He thought I would crumble. He thought I would react the way he had always expected me to. And yet, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My fingers traced the edge of the paper, brushing over the smooth surface, feeling its weight, its authority. It represented something terrifying, yes, but also something liberating. All those years of quiet endurance, of swallowed frustration, of unnoticed efforts. They had led me to this moment. And now the choice was mine. I could play into his expectations, or I could redefine the rules entirely. I exhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs and release the tension coiled in my chest. The chapel was nearly empty now, save for a few family members lingering near the exit. The sun outside had shifted slightly, sending warm streaks of light through the stained glass, splashing colored patterns onto the polished floor. The way the light hit the envelope in my lap made it seem almost alive, like it was urging me to act. And I did. I reached for the pen I had kept in my purse, one I had always carried for errands and notes, but never imagined I would need for something this monumental. The ink felt smooth as I uncapped it, and I paused for a heartbeat, savoring the gravity of the moment. Around me, the shadows of the pews stretched long in the afternoon sun, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer in Eric's shadow. As I began to sign, a mixture of emotions surged through me: anger, grief, and a surprising clarity. Every stroke of the pen felt like a declaration. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer someone whose feelings could be ignored, whose contributions could be erased, whose presence could be taken for granted. The ink glided across the page, leaving an indelible mark, a tangible manifestation of a decision I had arrived at not in haste, but through years of accumulated insight. Eric's reaction was immediate, though subtle. He had been expecting resistance, perhaps a flinch or a sharp retort. Instead, he saw measured calm. He saw resolve. His eyes widened ever so slightly, his jaw tightening as he realized something he hadn't anticipated. The signature, the very act he thought would cement his control, had become my instrument of authority. The air in the chapel felt heavier suddenly, charged with a quiet electricity. I imagined the shock radiating through the few people still nearby. Aunt Linda's eyebrows lifted, my mother's grip on my brother's arm tightened, and even the funeral director's hands froze mid-adjustment of a chair. It was a private act, yet it carried weight far beyond the confines of our grief. A single signature, executed with calm precision, had shifted the balance. I set the pen down gently, exhaling again, and let my gaze wander to Eric. He opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to argue or demand an explanation, but no words came. The divorce papers now bore my mark, and the reality of that action seemed to strike him in a way that words never could. He was seeing me differently in that moment, not just as the woman he had married, but as a force he had underestimated. And the faintest quiver in his confident stance revealed the truth. He realized he had miscalculated. The shock didn't end there. As I looked around the chapel, I noticed the subtle ways the signature began to ripple through the environment. My brother shifted in his seat, nodding slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it had taken. My mother's eyes glistened with a mix of sorrow and pride, and for the first time that day, I felt a sense of alignment, a quiet solidarity with the people who mattered most to me. Eric's lips pressed into a thin line as he picked up the papers, turning them over slowly as though the movement might somehow reverse the reality he faced. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind, the sudden panic that comes when control is stripped away not by confrontation, but by deliberate calm. He had assumed he held all the cards. He had assumed that my grief would make me pliable, that the funeral setting would paralyze me into compliance. He had been wrong, and the signature confirmed it. I let my mind wander back to the years of minor conflicts that had led here, the nights spent arguing over trivial things, the quiet disappointments, the subtle dismissals that had gone unnoticed by everyone else but me. The cumulative weight of those moments had prepared me for this act, had trained me in a way I hadn't realized. Each small instance of neglect, each eroded conversation, had built resilience within me. And now, that resilience manifested in ink on paper, a tangible assertion of my agency. The sound of shuffling feet echoed through the chapel as more mourners exited, offering quiet condolences. They didn't see the internal calculus unfolding between me and Eric, but they felt the tension, the shift in atmosphere. The air was charged with unspoken recognition. Something had changed, something fundamental. The signature was not merely legal, it was symbolic. It was the point at which the quiet, invisible power I had accumulated over years finally found expression. Eric finally spoke, his voice low, measured, almost forced. "Blair, why?" There was no malice, not yet. Only disbelief. He had expected resistance, tears, panic, or anger. Instead, he found a woman who had understood her own worth, who had turned his anticipated leverage into her own statement of strength. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. The weight of my calm was more potent than any verbal confrontation could have been. I glanced at him, meeting his eyes steadily. "Because I can," I said, finally, my voice calm but resolute. "And because it's time." The words were simple, yet they carried the gravity of all the moments he had dismissed, all the feelings he had ignored. In that instant, the signature on the papers became more than ink. It became a manifesto of self-respect, an assertion that I would no longer be passive in my own life. The silence lingered, filled with tension. Eric's lips parted, perhaps to protest, to negotiate, to claim some remaining control, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I carefully collected the papers, folding them neatly, aware of the subtle power shift that had just occurred. The signature was more than a legal action. It was a turning point. It was proof that the quiet, deliberate choices I made could carry more weight than any outburst or confrontation he might have expected. As the afternoon light shifted further, streaming through the windows and highlighting the papers in my hands, I felt a sense of clarity I had never experienced before. I realized that power in a marriage or in life was not always about dominance or aggression. Sometimes it was about patience, observation, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment was truly yours. And in this quiet act, amid grief and betrayal, I had discovered a reservoir of inner strength that I had not fully recognized until now. I could see Eric processing all of this, the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight falter in his confident posture. He had assumed that signing the papers would intimidate me, that it would render me powerless, that grief would chain me to fear. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had awakened a calm, deliberate force he had never accounted for. My signature had shifted power, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through clarity and self-awareness. In that moment, I also realized the small, everyday ways I had been asserting my agency without noticing. The quiet moments of decision, the unspoken refusals to accept dismissive behavior, the subtle but firm boundaries I had set over the years, they had all been leading to this crescendo. The signature was simply the first visible proof of what had already been true internally. I was no longer passive, I was no longer invisible, and I was no longer controlled. Even the surrounding environment seemed to acknowledge the shift. The afternoon light caught on the polished floors, reflecting the intricate patterns of the stained glass in a way that seemed almost symbolic. Shadows and light intertwined across the chapel, mirroring the interplay of grief and empowerment, of betrayal and assertion. The room itself felt quieter, the air more deliberate, as if recognizing the significance of this pivotal act. I looked down at the papers one final time, feeling the ink dry under my fingertips, solidifying the moment. Every line, every stroke was a testament not just to a legal reality, but to the emotional journey I had undergone. The grief, the betrayals, the quiet accumulation of strength. I had turned a tool of humiliation into a mechanism of self-assertion. And in that act, I had reclaimed not just power, but dignity. Eric's eyes met mine, no longer smug, no longer confident. There was hesitation there now, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't existed before. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of equilibrium, a balance restored. The signature had shifted power, yes, but it had also revealed the deeper truth. Strength often lies not in confrontation, but in deliberate, mindful action that respects both the gravity of the moment and the self-worth of the actor. The moment I placed the signed papers back into the envelope and set it aside, the air between Eric and me shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. It was no longer just a personal revelation or a quiet assertion of independence. It was a tangible rupture, an unseen line that had been crossed. Even in the quiet of the chapel, I could feel the subtle tremors of his disbelief, the tension in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he tried to recalculate a world he thought he controlled. The drive home from the funeral was unervingly silent. Eric didn't speak. I kept my eyes forward on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, aware that the car had become a temporary arena for the fallout of my decision. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted across suburban streets, long shadows stretching into the yards of perfectly ordinary homes, their mundane normality mocking the chaos inside me. I imagined the people inside those houses, unaware of the drama unfolding just blocks away, and felt a faint, almost ironic satisfaction. Life moved on, indifferent just as I intended to. Eric's first words, when they finally came, were careful, measured, and slightly clipped. "Blair, did you think this through?" His tone wasn't accusatory, not entirely. It carried a blend of incredulity and panic I had never heard from him before. It was the sound of a man realizing that his assumptions had been shattered. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of my calm intensify the reality of the moment. Eventually, I broke it, my voice quiet but firm. "Yes, I thought it through. More than you probably ever considered." The statement landed between us like a small, deliberate shockwave. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward the envelope on the seat between us, as if seeing it for the first time in its full gravity. Every subtle shift of his posture betrayed his internal calculation, the first tremors of the consequences that would unfold. The first ripple of consequences hit immediately when he reached home. His usual ease with friends and colleagues faltered as he realized that a single quiet act, the signature I had placed on those papers, had removed the leverage he had assumed was his. He had built strategies in his mind for months, perhaps even years, predicated on the belief that I would falter in times of pressure. Now, those strategies were invalid, nullified by a calm decision executed in the eye of grief. Within hours, I began to notice small changes in how he approached me. The casual arrogance, the offhand dismissals that had punctuated years of our life together, evaporated. He became cautious, measured, even apologetic in ways that felt foreign. When he asked if I wanted to discuss the paperwork, his voice lacked the certainty it usually carried, replaced by a thin veneer of tentative negotiation. The reversal of roles was subtle but unmistakable. Where he had assumed dominance, now he approached me with the anxiety of someone negotiating for stability rather than dictating terms. Even friends and family began noticing the shift. My sister, who had quietly observed our dynamics over the years, commented gently during an afternoon visit, "Blair, something feels different. He's careful, almost hesitant around you." Her observation wasn't flattery. It was an acknowledgement of the subtle power recalibration that had occurred. I realized that the signature wasn't just a legal formality. It was a seismic event in our interpersonal landscape, redefining relationships that had long been static. The next day brought its own wave of consequences when Eric attempted to assert influence in areas he had previously dominated. I watched him, in a mix of curiosity and silent satisfaction, as he navigated conversations with lawyers, family members, and even our neighbors with an unusual caution. In ordinary circumstances, he would have approached these discussions with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance, assuming he could sway outcomes with charm or subtle manipulation. Now, however, there was hesitation. He calculated every word, every gesture, deeply aware, that his control had slipped. Financially, the consequences were immediate and frustrating for him. I had learned in conversations with my father long before his passing how to navigate joint accounts, property agreements, and legal documentation in ways that didn't scream confrontation but offered protection. The signature I placed had not only formalized the divorce, it had triggered clauses, highlighted liabilities, and revealed a network of safeguards I had quietly built over the years. Eric discovered, too late, that his assumptions about my dependence were outdated, inaccurate, and ultimately irrelevant. It was subtle at first. Small slips of tension appeared when he tried to access accounts or assert control over shared assets. One evening, he casually mentioned the car lease, expecting compliance, only to be met with a firm, calm refusal. "It's no longer a joint decision," I said simply, and the way he froze, processing the statement, was almost satisfying in its precision. He had imagined scenarios in which I would beg, falter, or hesitate. None of those scenarios came true. Every step he took now was calculated, hesitant, unsure. The balance of power had shifted quietly but irreversibly. Social consequences also began to emerge. Mutual friends who had long perceived Eric as dominant now began noticing his restraint, the subtle way he recalibrated interactions around me. A dinner with neighbors, intended as casual, became a lesson in control as he carefully monitored what he said, how he gestured, even how he approached conversations. There was a palpable tension in the air, as though the community had unconsciously recognized the shift. I observed him from across the table, noting the slight tremor in his confidence, the absence of the casual authority he had always wielded. Meanwhile, the emotional consequences were harder to track, but just as real. I felt a strange liberation in every small interaction that no longer carried the weight of his dominance. Even a brief disagreement about groceries or household schedules became an assertion of my independence, a demonstration of how subtly the power balance had shifted. Each conversation, each decision I made, now carried a weight that it hadn't before. And Eric, for the first time, had to consider my reactions seriously instead of assuming compliance. At home, the atmosphere transformed. Ordinary routines, making coffee, preparing meals, deciding on weekend plans, carried new significance. I noticed how Eric's tone had softened in ways that were subtle but undeniable. He was no longer issuing instructions or expecting immediate acquiescence. He began framing suggestions as questions, choices as collaborative, and even minor decisions were preceded by a brief, hesitant pause as he measured my likely response. The everyday minutiae of life became a field where consequences unfolded, small but cumulative, teaching him lessons that had been ignored for years. Even the extended family became subtly involved. A relative, unaware of the signature's legal ramifications, remarked during a casual conversation, "I don't know, something feels different about Eric lately." Their observation wasn't about the divorce itself, but about the shift in demeanor, the subtle hum of accountability that now accompanied his presence. It was a reminder that the consequences of one decisive action ripple far beyond the immediate context, affecting perceptions, relationships, and the social landscape in ways that are invisible until suddenly undeniable. Eric's attempts to reconcile or negotiate further power moves revealed the depth of his miscalculation. He scheduled meetings with lawyers, assuming that discussion or argument could restore his perceived authority. But I was prepared, calm, and deliberate. I responded with measured statements, references to agreements, and reminders of past arrangements that reinforced the truth. The signature was legally valid, strategically placed, and emotionally intentional. Every attempt he made to regain influence only highlighted the strength of my prior planning and the clarity of my resolve. Even minor conflicts, once swept under the rug or manipulated through passive aggression, now revealed themselves in stark relief. He suggested a vacation plan, expecting cooperation, and I declined, calmly citing logistical reasons I had prepared in advance. His hesitation, the slight flicker of doubt in his eyes, was evidence of how thoroughly the power dynamic had shifted. Ordinary domestic interactions, once mundane, now became subtle arenas for asserting independence and enforcing boundaries, a lesson he was forced to learn slowly and reluctantly with each minor incident. The social and emotional consequences intertwined in a way that was almost cinematic. At a family gathering the following weekend, Eric tried to guide conversations, positioning himself as the anchor of authority. But I noticed the subtle recalibration of everyone around him, the way my siblings engaged with me differently, the slight hesitation in his tone as others included me more actively, the small nods of recognition from friends who had witnessed our tension at the funeral. Each instance reinforced a new reality. My signature had not only legal weight, but social and psychological impact as well. I felt an unexpected mixture of vindication and restraint. The consequences unfolding around Eric weren't dramatic or loud. They were quiet, almost invisible to an outsider, but profoundly real. Every hesitation, every recalculated gesture, every subtle expression of doubt was evidence that a single, deliberate act of self-assertion could trigger ripple effects far beyond immediate expectations. It was an affirmation that patience, awareness, and precise action often carry more power than confrontation or anger. And as the days passed, I began to notice the longer-term consequences. Eric grew increasingly anxious about missteps, second-guessing decisions that had once come naturally to him. Simple errands, mundane appointments, even casual conversations with mutual acquaintances now required calculation, reflection, and a constant awareness of the shift he could no longer control. The power balance, once skewed entirely in his favor, had been quietly but irrevocably rebalanced. The weeks following the funeral and the signature felt strange, almost surreal, like living in a suspended world where every ordinary detail carried new significance. I woke each morning with a quiet sense of control that I had never experienced before. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was subtle, an undercurrent of calm assurance that seemed to emanate from my bones. The signature had shifted more than just the legal and relational landscape. It had shifted how I perceived myself. I started small, almost imperceptibly, reclaiming spaces in my life that I had long ceded. The kitchen, once a domain of silent compromise, became a place of deliberate choice. I cooked meals the way I wanted, experimented with flavors I had shelved for years, and refused Eric's usual critiques or suggestions. Instead of tension, there was an unexpected lightness, a sense of freedom in simple actions. The scent of rosemary and garlic simmering in the pan seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that nurturing oneself could be a form of quiet rebellion. Outside the house, I began reclaiming routines I had abandoned. Morning walks through the neighborhood no longer carried the anxious undertone of shared schedules or unspoken obligations. I walked deliberately, breathing in the crisp air, observing familiar streets with fresh eyes. Children played in yards, neighbors exchanged greetings, and life moved at its ordinary pace. But for me, everything felt subtly altered. Ordinary spaces had become arenas for empowerment, places where I could practice the kind of agency I had only just recognized. The small victories compounded. At work, I started asserting my opinions in meetings with a new confidence. For years, I had carefully moderated my voice, fearing conflict or dismissal. But after the funeral, after the signature, I found myself speaking up without hesitation, presenting ideas I had previously buried, answering questions without deferring to others unnecessarily. Colleagues noticed. A few even commented on the subtle shift in my tone, the clarity and confidence that had always been there but had been hidden behind polite restraint. The personal consequences for Eric also became a natural backdrop to my growth. He approached our interactions cautiously, hesitant to overstep boundaries he once ignored. At first, I was conscious of monitoring his reactions, almost like a teacher observing a student relearning the rules. But gradually, his caution allowed me space to breathe, to experiment with asserting myself in ways I hadn't before. Even small interactions, deciding what to watch on television, choosing weekend activities, organizing errands, felt laden with meaning. I realized that reclaiming control over these micromoments was just as important as any legal or social leverage. One afternoon, I decided to tackle a long-postponed project, reorganizing the study where my father's old books and family records had sat untouched for months. The room smelled faintly of dust and aged paper, the sunlight through the blinds falling in geometric patterns across the floor. I carefully sifted through stacks, finding letters, photographs, and mementos that reminded me of my father's wisdom and strength. There was one letter written years ago in which he encouraged me to trust my instincts and stand firm in difficult times. Reading it now, tears came, but they were not tears of helpless grief. They were acknowledgement of the resilience that had always been within me. Eric watched quietly from the doorway, hesitant to interrupt, uncertain how to approach the space I was reclaiming. For the first time, I noticed how he lingered without speaking, almost as though he were learning the contours of the new dynamic. I didn't ask him to leave. I didn't engage him directly. Instead, I focused on organizing, arranging, and understanding. The act itself, turning disorder into order, felt like a metaphor for reclaiming my life. It was both literal and symbolic, a tangible step toward closure. Closure, I realized, wasn't a singular moment, but a series of small realizations. One morning, I brewed coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood. I noticed the rhythm of life, the dog walkers, the joggers, the mail carrier delivering letters. Everything moved forward, indifferent to grief, betrayal, or legal documents. And I felt a strange, grounding satisfaction. The world did not stop for heartbreak, and neither would I. I was learning to flow with it, to assert myself without fear or apology. The emotional landscape shifted, most dramatically during a conversation with my mother. We sat on the porch swing one evening, the air heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine. She reached over, holding my hand gently. "Blair, I've never seen you like this," she said softly. "There's a fire now, but also a calm, something balanced. I think your father would be proud." Her words struck me deeply. They weren't praise in the superficial sense. They were recognition of the quiet, deliberate strength I had cultivated. I realized that closure wasn't about erasing pain. It was about integrating it, letting grief coexist with empowerment. One unexpected twist of this journey was Eric's reaction outside our home. He began reaching out in ways that were tentative, sometimes awkward, occasionally sincere. One afternoon, he attempted to apologize for the way he had treated me over the years. The words were halting, imperfect, but they were there. And instead of a dramatic confrontation or a bitter rejection, I listened calmly, acknowledging his effort without letting it disrupt the boundary I had established. Closure, I realized, was as much about restraint and discernment as it was about confrontation. I also discovered strength in the unexpected ways the world responded to me. A neighbor, noticing subtle tension between Eric and me during a casual encounter, mentioned later how she admired my composure. A colleague at work commented on how my clarity had shifted team dynamics positively. These small affirmations were not what I sought. They were proof that when you operate from a place of integrity and calm strength, the world begins to reflect it back. The signature had shifted power in one moment, but the ongoing choices, the deliberate acts of self-respect, had created lasting ripples. Even in social settings, I noticed a change. At a family brunch one weekend, Eric attempted his usual conversational maneuvers, inserting himself as a dominant voice. I responded with measured engagement, asserting my perspective without conflict. The subtle shift was evident to everyone present. My cousins exchanged glances, my mother smiled quietly, and Eric's carefully cultivated confidence wavered. For the first time, I realized that reclaiming strength wasn't about winning arguments. It was about inhabiting space fully, unapologetically, and with integrity. Personal habits shifted as well. I began journaling every morning, documenting thoughts, reflections, and small victories. Writing became both a ritual and a compass, a way to track growth and clarity. I noticed patterns in my reactions, explored lingering grief, and celebrated subtle moments of agency. One entry captured a pivotal realization. I don't need permission to exist fully. I don't need validation to claim space or assert boundaries. Strength and closure are born from the choices I make, not the approval I seek. The more I embraced this approach, the more I noticed the emotional fallout stabilizing. Eric's occasional attempts at manipulation became less frequent, less effective. He realized, perhaps reluctantly, that I had moved beyond the need to react on his terms. Our home became calmer, not because tension disappeared entirely, but because I had transformed my approach. Boundaries, consistency, and deliberate engagement replaced anxiety, fear, and reactive energy. The signature had triggered this shift, but it was sustained by daily choices, conscious awareness, and the willingness to honor my own dignity. One evening, as I walked through the local park, I observed children playing, couples chatting, dogs chasing frisbees, and the sun lowering in the sky. I felt a profound sense of alignment, body, mind, and heart synchronized with the world's ordinary rhythm. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic in the external sense, but internally, it felt monumental. I realized that closure wasn't an endpoint imposed by circumstance. It was a state cultivated through conscious reflection, deliberate action, and an unwavering commitment to personal integrity. Even small acts of kindness became empowering. I volunteered at a local shelter, helped neighbors with small tasks, and engaged in casual mentorship with younger colleagues. Each interaction reinforced the idea that my life was no longer tethered to another person's manipulation or expectations. Freedom, strength, and closure intertwined in tangible, observable ways. And for the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own narrative, no longer a passive participant in someone else's story. Ultimately, closure came not from the signature alone, but from the cumulative effect of these deliberate daily actions. I realized that grief, betrayal, and struggle were not enemies. They were teachers. They forced clarity, resilience, and self-awareness. The signature had been the spark, but the fire of empowerment had been kindled and sustained through conscious engagement with my life. I had turned pain into insight, humiliation into awareness, and loss into the foundation for self-respect. I found myself laughing again, genuinely, without guilt or restraint. Small moments, a neighbor's joke, a misadventure at the grocery store, the delight of baking bread became celebrations of the autonomy I had reclaimed. The shadows of the past lingered, but they no longer defined me. I had discovered that true strength is not loud or performative. It is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in self-knowledge. And in the still moments when the world seemed to pause, I felt my father's presence, not as grief or longing, but as a quiet affirmation. He had always believed in my resilience, in my capacity to navigate challenge with clarity and courage. Now, I could feel that validation internally, independent of any external circumstance. I was whole in a way I hadn't been before, and the journey of grief, betrayal, and empowerment had brought me here with purpose and dignity. I smiled softly, closing my journal, setting aside the pen. The world outside my window continued its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to past drama or legal documents. And yet, within that ordinary rhythm, I had reclaimed extraordinary strength. The signature had shifted power, but the conscious choices afterward had cemented it. Closure was no longer a distant hope. It was a living reality, present in every action, every decision, every quiet affirmation of self-worth. Sitting in the quiet of my living room, I finally allowed myself to exhale fully. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed structurally, but because I had shifted within it. The memories of grief, the sting of betrayal, and the weight of the signature that had appended years of assumed control all lingered, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of my life. I realized that life itself doesn't pause for pain. It moves forward, indifferent yet persistent. And in that persistence, I had found my own pace, my own authority, my own strength. I looked around the room, at the framed photos of my father smiling warmly, at the little touches I had added over the weeks since the funeral, flowers in the corner, a neatly stacked pile of books on the coffee table, a journal where I had poured every thought and fear and victory. And I understood something profound. Closure is not a single moment, a single act, or even a single decision. It is a state of mind, cultivated through awareness, courage, and deliberate action. I thought about Eric, about the way his demeanor had shifted in the aftermath of the signature. The man I had married, so sure of his dominance, so accustomed to taking my compliance for granted, now hesitated in ways that were subtle but undeniable. And I felt no gloating, no vindictive triumph, just clarity. The power dynamic had changed. Yes, but the deeper transformation was internal. I had reclaimed my sense of self, my agency, and my dignity. I no longer waited for his permission, his approval, or even his recognition to assert my boundaries or live authentically. That, I realized, was the ultimate consequence of the signature. It wasn't the paper itself, but the awareness it unlocked in me that could never be revoked. As I sipped my coffee, watching the morning sunlight spill across the floor, I reflected on how ordinary life had taken on extraordinary meaning. Simple things, a walk in the neighborhood, the laughter of a child passing by, the aroma of fresh bread baking, reminded me that empowerment often lives in small, everyday moments. These were the things that made life rich, that grounded me, and that allowed me to integrate grief, betrayal, and growth into a coherent sense of purpose. I understood that my father's passing, Eric's betrayal, and even the confrontation at the funeral were not isolated tragedies. They were catalysts shaping a version of me that was stronger, wiser, and unafraid. And in the stillness, I finally allowed myself to feel peace. Not the fleeting, superficial peace that comes from avoidance, but the deep, rooted peace that comes from having faced reality, embraced it fully, and emerged whole. I had learned that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and persistent, like the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Closure, I realized, is not about forgetting, nor is it about revenge. It is about recognition of truth, of self-worth, and of the life you choose to claim for yourself. Looking out the window, I smiled softly, feeling the warmth of the sunlight, the quiet hum of life around me, and the profound knowledge that I had survived, endured, and transformed. I had grieved, I had confronted, and I had reclaimed. The signature at the funeral had shifted power in the world, yes, but more importantly, it had shifted me from a woman defined by others' choices to one defined by her own courage, clarity, and unshakable strength. I was free, whole, and ready to live fully, with every small moment carrying the weight and beauty of my own unwavering resolve.